Hello YouTube. So I am going to take a stab at the next part of this text by Levinas. In the previous video, uh, he began to talk about the relationship of the same to the other, right, and sort of try to carve out the character of that relationship. And he starts talking in very general terms. He tries to get more and more specific. And he ended that chunk of text with a term can remain absolutely at the point of departure of relationship only as I. So what he's saying is that the same has to be an I. It has to be a subject, right? And then he goes on to sort of sketch out what he means by the I. He does it over a few paragraphs. It's a fairly short passage, but it's kind of essential, right? Because if everything that he's trying to get at in terms of an ethics is about the relationship between the I, or the same, and the other, we need to have some concept of what the I is, right? How, in order to describe how that relationship, or let's say the character of that relationship. So he touches on Hegel in here. He uses a lot of language that I would identify as Hegelian. He also touches in a slick way on Fichte, and gives a sort of criticism of Fichte. Sorry, I'm just trying to pick out where I'm going to end. So he doesn't seem to want to sketch out like a comprehensive theory of the I. More like he's kind of drawing on different places to talk about this phenomenon. And I'm not sure, as the book goes on, he might go through what the I is in more and more depth. It's totally possible. But here he just sets aside a few sort of paragraphs for understanding this. But what he really wants to get at is the relation between the same and the other, right? So he says, he begins, to be I is, over and beyond any individuation that can be derived from a system of references, to have identity as one's content, right? To be I is to have identity as one's content. Now, the word content there is somewhat mysterious. What does that mean, right? To have identity as one's content. Well, the way I read this is what's my content? My content is, my name is Mike. I am a smoker. I live in the South. I work at a restaurant, right? I have a certain educational background. I have relationships in my life, friendships, etc. And these are all sort of pieces of content that make me up, right? To be I is to have identity as one's content. What that means is that the I, like all of those things about myself, are heterogeneous, right? They can be sort of taken away. Like someone else can work at a restaurant and not be me, right? Someone else can work at a restaurant and not be a smoker. Someone can be a smoker and not work at a restaurant, right? These are all sort of pieces that don't have any necessary relationship to one another. So what the I is, it's to pull these things together into one thing, right? To pull all these heterogeneous aspects, these sort of different qualities, if you like, to pull them together and to say, that's me, right? That's what it means, I think, to say to be I is to have identity in one's content. He goes on. The I is not a being that always remains the same. Now, this is important because this first clause here, he's anticipating a criticism, right? If you say to be I is to have identity as one's content, then are you not open to the criticism that, like, that if my content, like, changes, right? If I leave my restaurant that I work at, if I were to quit smoking or something like that, does that mean I'm not the same I anymore, right? If the I is sort of contingent on its content. And so he's preempting that criticism here, and I think it's a very intelligent move to do so. He says the I is not a being that always remains the same, but is the being whose existing consists in identifying itself, in recovering its identity throughout all that happens to it. It is the primordial identity, the primordial work of identification. So this is important because to be I for Levinas, it's not that I am identical to my content, right? It's that work of taking all these pieces of content and synthesizing them. That's what the I is. The I is the act, if you like, of taking all of these pieces and making them into one thing. So those pieces can change, and if they change, the I tries to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? It's the process of sort of reconstructing an identity, right? And I don't want to. We should be careful here with the word identity because that is a slippery term. Identity means two things, right? We can talk about identity in the sense of identity politics, right? I am a white male, right? That is an identity that I have. But identity also follows from, it's the idea of the law of identity, right? So I am a white male. You can say that, put that more formally and say I equals white male, right? That's an identity. A equals A, right? And so it's sort of in both of these senses that he's using the word identity. I equal all of my content, right? So yeah. He goes on, the I is identical in its very alterations. It represents them to itself and thinks them. The universal identity in which the heterogeneous can be embraced has the ossature of a subject of the first person. Universal thought is an I think. So he says that anything that can take heterogeneous elements and synthesize them, put them together in this way, has the skeleton of a subject, right? The ossature of a subject. It's very evocative language. This is what he describes as being the bones of what it is to be a subject. And then he has that line, universal thought is an I think. And that I think is obviously tied to Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. He goes on. The I is identical in its very alterations in another sense. Oh, that's how I started that previous paragraph. The I is identical in its very alterations. What that means is, as it changes, the I is identical to its content, not in the sense that its content is static, but the I only exists in as much as that content is ever changing. Right? That's what I think it means. He goes on. The I is identical in its very alterations in yet another sense. The I that thinks, which is a Kantian term, hearkens to itself, thinking, or takes fright before its depths, and is to itself an other. So I can conceive of myself as an other, right? And I think that this is tied to the Kantian view of the subject. And I could unpack that further, but I'll just leave that hanging. It is to itself an other. It thus discovers the famous naivety of its thought, which thinks straight on as one follows one's nose. It hearkens to itself thinking and surprises itself being dogmatic, foreign to itself. But faced with this alterity, the I is the same, merges with itself, is incapable of apostasy with regard to this surprising self. Right? So he's saying, even though I can encounter myself as an other, I can surprise myself, right? I can think about myself, right? I can look at myself in the mirror. That's sort of the classical or the classic visual metaphor here. And in this sense, I encounter myself as an other, and I can be surprised at what I see. But I can't, he says, it's incapable of apostasy with regard to this surprising self. So I can't disavow that which I see in the mirror, right? I can't get rid of that in some sense. I can't push that away. Like, I'm stuck with that. And the I is the same, merges with itself, right? Like, so what he's saying is that I and myself as other, there's a sort of contradiction there. On the one hand, I experience this as an other, and on the other hand, it's still the same. And in fact, that otherness is a condition of possibility for that sameness. Like, those two categories are tied together, right? You can't have an I. I think one of the things he's getting at is that you can't have an I that's this self-identifyingness without this experience of self as other, and vice versa. So he wants to say you can encounter yourself as other, but that's not really the other, right? And this is where it starts talking about Hegel, and it gets interesting. Hegelian phenomenology, where self-consciousness is the distinguishing of what is not distinct, that is, the carving of something up through analysis, right? Expresses the universality of the same identifying itself in the alterity of objects' thought, and despite the opposition of self to self. So I identify myself with the alterity of objects' thought, right? And by thought, I might be better said cognized, right? Experienced in this sense is thought. So I might have my car. I might feel strongly about my car. I see myself in my car, right? It's an other thing, but it's a part of my identity to drive the car that I drive, right? So I identify myself with this alterity. and I do that in spite of the opposition of self to self. So what I was just describing as the I as something identical, and the I is something you look in the mirror, something separated, right? Despite that split, that ontological difference, I can still look at the world and sort of suck objects into my identity. And then he gives a quote from Hegel. I distinguish myself from myself, and therein I am immediately aware that this factor distinguished from me is not distinguished. Right? So again, this is the experience of looking in the mirror. Or if you were to maybe write a journal, right, and then go back and read it. The person represented in that journal, you feel, especially if you take a little while and then go back and read it, you feel that like you can't quite relate to that person anymore. That person seems to be an other. So yeah, that would be another way of thinking about it. I distinguish myself from myself, and therein I am immediately aware that this factor distinguished from me is not distinguished. So I look in the mirror and I recognize that as other, but I also recognize that it's not other. Right? I, the self-same being, thrust myself away from myself. But this which is distinguished, which is set up as unlike me, is immediately on its being distinguished, no distinction for me. End quote. Right? So that's a quote from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And Levinas goes on. The difference is not a difference. The I, as other, is not an other. We will not retain from this citation Hegel's affirmation of the provisional character of immediate evidence. The I that repels the self, lived as repugnance, the I riveted to itself, lived as ennui, are modes of self-consciousness, and the rest of the unrendable identity of the I and the self. So the language that he's using there, he's distinguishing between the I and the self. You know, that thing in the mirror is the self. The thing that experiences the thing in the mirror is the I. Right? So he tries to split that into two. And he says that the relationship between those two things is uneasy. Right? And they can stand in all sorts of different relationships. Right? The I can relate to the self in all sorts of different ways. But every one of those ways is a mode of self-identification, right? Every one of those, like, I might say, like, the self is something horrible, right? You might see that in some version of Buddhism, right? The self is something horrible. The ego, right? Or the I would be the ego, I guess. And that's something horrible, and we're trying to transcend that, or whatever you like. But that transcendence, all that does is change the relationship between the I and the self, right? And it's a different mode of identification. They are modes of self-consciousness, he says. And they rest on the unrendable identity of the I and the self. So you can't pull these things apart. He goes on. The alterity of the I that takes itself for another may strike the imagination of the poet precisely because it is but the play of the same. The negation of the I by the self is precisely one of the modes of identification of the I. Right? So he wants to say that there's a tension between these two ideas, the I and the self. And if the self were to ever overcome the I, that would just be another way of talking about the I, right? Like, one can never, even though there is this tension, one can never be separated from the other. And that's a struggle, right? He seems to paint that as being being something like difficult, even tragic, right? Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. Because he goes on then to talk about the I and the world, and I think that that's going to be the third thing that I'm going to split this into. So yeah, that's Levinas's view of the I. The I is something that that is in this weird state of contention always, and it's something that, like, it's defined by that state of contention between the I and the self, right? This is what identity is. And the I is really just the work of taking all of these things that you identify with yourself and identifying them as part of yourself. That's all that work, right? And the self is sort of who you think you are, right? It's your image of yourself. Again, you look in the mirror, or you write a journal, or something like that. Or if you were a cobbler, we used this example before when talking about Hegel. If you're a cobbler, you make a shoe. In some sense, you put yourself into that shoe, and you recognize that that shoe is a reflection of yourself, right? So that's one statement of what the self is. It's the self is the I put out into the world. Yeah. So again, we get at, Levinas is a pretty, in some sense, is a very depressing thinker, right? He thinks that being is this horrible thing, and that's kind of his rebuttal to Heidegger. Heidegger thinks that being is like the nourishing, sort of the clearing in the forest. He uses a lot of Germanic sort of metaphors like that. Levinas wants to say, no, being is terrible and nauseating and horrifying. And he borrows from Hegel. I mean, all this talk about the I and the self and that relationship is very Hegelian. And it's all about, like, Hegel's sort of all about struggle. He says things like, there's one great quote from Hegel where he says, the theater of history, no, the history of the world is not the theater of happiness. Periods of happiness are just blank pages, right? So history for Hegel consists in struggle, in war, etc. Everything, in some sense, consists in struggle. And so Levinas, it's interesting to me that he would borrow from Hegel. It's sort of a strange thing to do. And I think the relationship between Levinas and Hegel would probably make for a good paper. Right? I'm sure that paper's been written, but probably make for a good paper if someone wants to write that. So yeah, that's Levinas's idea of what the I is. And that will come into play as he carves out his ethics in one way or another. All right. Have a good day.